When Henry VIII died, his body was so bloated and decomposed that his coffin leaked, and stray dogs lapped up the fluids. Imagine the once mighty King of England being reduced to a stench so foul it emptied entire rooms. So how did that happen? Buckle up, because we're about to find out. The Golden Prince. But to understand just how grotesque Henry's end was, we need to rewind to the very beginning, because his downfall is only shocking when you see the height he fell from. Henry Tudor was born on June 28, 1491, and when he became king at just 17, he wasn't the monstrous figure we think of today. In fact, he was the complete opposite. Tall, broad-shouldered, with golden red hair and striking blue eyes, Henry was the poster child for Renaissance royalty. Foreign ambassadors gushed about him, describing his angelic countenance and athletic grace. At court tournaments, he was a champion jouster and an unrivaled dancer, moving with the energy of a man who seemed born to rule both the battlefield and the ballroom. For the people of England, this wasn't just a king. It was almost like having a living god on the throne. Henry's youth was a perfect blend of majesty and charisma, the kind of ruler who embodied strength, confidence, and vitality. The image of him in those early years is so dramatically different from what came later that it almost feels like two different men entirely. And that's where the irony really begins. Because the prince who once dazzled Europe with his charm and vigor would eventually rot away in a body so diseased and grotesque that courtiers had to cover their noses just to stand in the same room. So what happened? The answer lies in one single accident, a moment that would set the course for his horrifying decline. Chapter 2. The Jousting Accident, Beginning of the End. It was January 1536, and Henry was 44 years old when disaster struck during a jousting tournament at Greenwich. The king, who had once prided himself on his strength and physical skill, was thrown violently from his horse, which then collapsed on top of him. For 2 hours, he lay unconscious, an event that not only terrified his court, but may have permanently changed both his body and his mind. The most obvious wound was to his right leg. What seemed like a bad injury at first soon became a permanent ulcer. It refused to heal and constantly festered, releasing a stench so foul that people claimed you could smell the king before you even saw him enter a room. For a ruler obsessed with image and majesty, this was humiliating beyond measure. Courtiers were forced to endure the odor in silence, pretending nothing was wrong, because even the slightest grimace could mean royal wrath. But the injury didn't just damage Henry's body. It may have altered his mind. Historians suggest the fall caused a traumatic brain injury, one that triggered violent mood swings, paranoia, and the kind of sudden rage that would later define his reign. Conveniently, or perhaps not, this was also the exact period when Henry accused his second wife, Anne Boleyn, of adultery and treason, sending her to the executioner's block. Physically weakened and mentally unstable, Henry began to spiral. Reduced mobility meant he could no longer indulge in the sports and jousts he loved. Instead, he turned to food and wine for comfort, and the pounds began piling on. What was once a proud, athletic frame began to swell into something bloated and monstrous. And this was only the beginning of the grotesque transformation. The once golden prince was slowly turning into the very nightmare he had always feared, his body rotting from within, while his mind unraveled above it. The decaying body and rotting flesh. After the jousting accident, Henry's decline wasn't gradual. It was like watching a slow-motion collapse of both man and myth. His once chiseled frame ballooned to over 400 pounds. His waist, which had measured a sleek 89 centimeters in his youth, swelled past 130. He became so large that his palaces literally had to be remodeled. Doorways widened, furniture reinforced, and a pulley system installed just to move him from room to room. Imagine being a king so powerful you could change your kingdom's religion with the stroke of a quill, but needing a machine to haul you into bed. And then there were the ulcers. His injured leg never healed, instead becoming an open wound that oozed pus and, according to eyewitnesses, exposed bone. The stench was unbearable. Contemporaries said his presence could be detected from 3 rooms away. Physicians, in their desperate attempts to help, only made things worse. They used cauterization with hot irons, ointments laced with arsenic and mercury, and endless bloodletting sessions that drained his strength but never cured the rot. Daily life became a grotesque ordeal. Every meal was a feast of excess, with Henry consuming thousands of calories of red meat and pies, washed down with oceans of beer and wine. Combined with immobility, this diet turned his body into a breeding ground for disease. Modern historians suggest he suffered from diabetes, gout, heart failure, and possibly recurring strokes. Each condition fed into the other, turning the once splendid Renaissance prince into a wheezing, ulcerated giant tormented by constant pain. This wasn't just a physical collapse, but a complete unraveling of his image as well. A king who had once represented majesty now inspired pity, disgust, and barely concealed dread. And as his body rotted, his mind began to follow. The paranoia and the court of fear. Pain has a way of twisting even the strongest personalities, and in Henry's case, it turned paranoia into policy. By his later years, the once charming king had become a suspicious tyrant, prone to rages and convinced everyone was plotting against him. Courtiers learned to measure every word, every glance, because a wrong phrase, or even an unlucky look, could mean an accusation of treason. The executions never stopped. Close friends, trusted advisors, and even family members weren't safe. His paranoia spiraled so far that just days before his own death, Henry ordered the execution of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, one of the brightest young noblemen of the age. It was less a legal sentence than a reflection of the king's growing obsession with betrayal. His marriages reveal the same decline. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, barely 19 when she wed him, sought comfort elsewhere rather than endure her deformed and malodorous husband. When the affair was discovered, Henry's response was predictable. She and her lover were sent to the scaffold. His final marriage to Catherine Parr was less a romance and more a caretaking arrangement. She acted as nursemaid, tending to his grotesque body with a patience that must have seemed miraculous given what had happened to her predecessors. Fear of poisoning consumed him. He established elaborate systems of food tasting, dish inspection, and utensil monitoring. Yet for all his precautions, his true enemy was always within, his own body turning against him, his own mind corroded by paranoia. The once golden prince of Europe was now a tyrant who terrified his court as much with his temper as with his stench. And as his body continued to rot, the end became impossible to deny, even if no one at court dared to say it out loud. The final days of agony. By the winter of 1546, Henry VIII was living in what can only be described as a walking tomb. Gangrene had set into his legs, the ulcers gaped wider, and the infections raged unchecked. Courtiers whispered of the smell, clutching perfume-soaked cloths to their faces as they attended to him. The mighty king was now a creature people endured rather than admired. Fevers came and went. Delirium clouded his judgment. Witnesses claimed he muttered the names of his dead wives, Jane Seymour, who had given him his only male heir, and even Anne Boleyn, whose ghost they said tormented him. But despite the clear signs of his impending death, no one dared utter the words. English law considered it treason to predict the king's death. So physicians smiled and insisted recovery was possible, even as decomposition had already begun while Henry was still alive. On January 27, 1547, he finally acknowledged the inevitable. Unable to speak, he allowed Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to take his hand and squeezed it when asked if he died a faithful Christian. That was his final conscious act. In the early hours of January 28th, at 55 years old, the once magnificent Henry VIII, the man who had reshaped England forever, exhaled his last tortured breath. But even in death, the indignities weren't over. His coffin, hastily sealed, couldn't contain the gases and fluids from his enormous, decaying body. At Sion Abbey, during the long wait for his state funeral, the coffin actually burst and cadaveric fluid leaked onto the chapel floor. Chroniclers record that stray dogs lapped it up, a grotesque final humiliation for the king who once commanded nations to tremble. The legacy of rot and power. In its essence, Henry VIII's death was a symbolic collapse of everything he had built. Here was a man who had stood taller, stronger, and more majestic than any prince in Europe, yet in the end, all the crowns, palaces, and proclamations couldn't save him from his own rotting flesh. He was buried with all the pomp of royalty in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, beside Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him Edward VI, the son for whom Henry had risked everything. But irony shadowed even that legacy. Edward ruled for only 6 years before dying young. The Tudor line Henry had sacrificed wives and faith to preserve would instead be carried forward by his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, the very children of the women he had discarded and destroyed. Historians often note the contrast between Henry's portraits and his end. It's a reminder that absolute power, no matter how dazzling, cannot rewrite the laws of nature. His political legacy, the Church of England, the break from Rome, the reshaping of English monarchy, still reverberates today. The man who once seemed larger than life became a spectacle of decay, his body betraying him in the most humiliating ways imaginable. Let us know what you think about the horrible end of a tyrant in the comments.